Okay, I intend for this to be very informal. You're all sitting neatly in rows, and I'm standing up here, and it feels intimidating, and that's not what I want. So, thank you, Mr. Lewis. I'm going to put your feet up. There we go. Okay. I really want this to be interactive. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions, so I'll get us started, but I am going to pause often for questions, and please feel free to interrupt at any time. So let me start by, I'm going to start with the bold assumption that you like this school and you think your kids are getting an exceptional education. And I hope that your kids actually really like school too. So my first question to you was going to be, what do you, some of you I know are new parents here, so if you've seen any changes in your kids or observations that those of you who transferred noticed, or just things about your kids as opposed to kids from other schools, characteristics that seem to separate them out as VanDamme Academy students. Is there anything that you would name as something that seems different? Yes?
One, Carrie, and my daughter Marley started the end of last year, 4 weeks. And she's in third grade. Mm-hmm. And the biggest change is her love for education.
Okay. So that's definitely something I hear a lot. They love for education. So describing things like getting into the car and actually talking about what they did during the day.
I guess more passionate about each and every subject.
Okay. So speaking actually with a genuine personal passion about it. Anything else? Yes.
Siona, my daughter's in third grade, and with Marty actually, and then we moved here last year. And the biggest thing, in addition to what Carrie just said, is that she's become very independent. She was independent, but she's independent about resolving everything that comes her way.
Okay.
So she feels confident about talking to her teachers, because I think teachers are very open.
Okay, great. So we've got independent and confident and passionate and enthusiastic about school. And anything else I'll throw in here, but yes.
Not bored.
Not bored. Okay. Actually feeling fulfilled. And another thing that I hear on a regular basis is that they're good observers. They become very good observers. So people will tell me they go on trips and the kids seem to notice and pay attention to things that they feel like they hadn't paid attention to before, but just have habituated looking around them, observing, taking things in, and thinking about what they're taking in.
And asking questions.
Okay. So these are all characteristics I certainly notice about the students here, and that I think separate them from their peers when they go on to high school, too. So my next question is, well, where does that come from? Why do the kids who attend this school have that level of enthusiasm, that confidence, that interest in the world around them, that passion for learning? And there are lots of things you could point to explain that. So we've got a great bunch of teachers here. A lot of them sitting right there. They are warm, they are intelligent, they are knowledgeable about their fields, they're accessible, and that's obviously a factor. We have really good parents here. The kids are coming from good families with involved parents and educated parents and interesting people. That obviously has an influence too. Our class sizes are small. We can give them a lot of individual and personal attention. All of these things are relevant, and all of these things are things that come up in the conversations about what the problems are at other schools, particularly the public schools. The class sizes are too big. Maybe it's a problem of the teachers' unions and not having qualified and passionate teachers. And, all of these things come up in conversation. But the thing that I wanted to tell you tonight is that I believe the number one most important principle that explains all of those things that you described as distinct VanDamme Academy student traits is the principle of hierarchy. And that's going to seem probably a little bit strange. What does that word even mean? And how does that explain the kids' passion, their enthusiasm, their interest in the world, their independence, their love of learning? All right, so I should probably start by explaining what hierarchy means. Now, I know a lot of you probably have some familiarity with this term. Who feels like they don't really have any idea what I mean when I say hierarchy as applied to education? Everybody knows? Well, you're all, yeah? You don't really know? Okay, well, what I mean simply by hierarchy is that there is a necessary order to learning. There's an order of a sequence that is an order of inclusion that provides a structure and a process to learning. And things have to be learned in that sequence to be sincerely, legitimately learned. So what do I mean by that? That's pretty abstract in general. Well, let's just look at Seth. That's an easy way to start because he's just getting started on this learning journey. Well, when a child first starts to develop language, which means they're first starting to develop real thoughts, what do you teach them first? Well, you point to objects, right? That's a chair, ball, dog, things that are part of their immediate environment that they're seeing on a routine basis, and you point it out and you tell them the names of those things. Then they might start to learn, after they've learned these simple concepts, they might start to refine those concepts. So, for example, Seth, at this time of year, is learning the difference between a ball and a Christmas ornament. Okay, he sees this thing hanging on the tree, and he wants to call that a ball. And I say, well, it looks like a ball, but that's an ornament. So now he's learning the term ornament. And obviously there are many spherical things that he needs to differentiate from balls. Then you also start to learn about the behavior of those objects. So one importance of the difference between a ball and an ornament is you throw a ball and it bounces. You throw an ornament and it breaks. So he needs to learn the difference between bouncing and breaking and the characteristics of these two things that explain that they will have different behaviors. So what will happen in the course of his learning and in all of our educations is he has to learn these simple level concepts, then more refined and sophisticated concepts like ornament, then propositions about those concepts. Balls bounce, ornaments break. Then more sophisticated propositions and more sophisticated concepts. And it grows. It's it's not a linear structure. It's not a pyramid structure. It just grows in all these, I think of like stalagmites or something. It's just all of these different structures growing together and forming this big interwoven structure. But it's unavoidable that some form the bottom and others are higher and more abstract, and still others more abstract, and so on. So imagine that I gave birth to Seth. He started to show glimmerings of understanding of language, and I looked at him and said, now look, balls bounce and ornaments break, and the reason is there are these laws of motion, and tried to explain this whole sophisticated physical explanation of brittleness, and it would be ridiculous, and you'd look at me like I was crazy, because that's obviously jumping the hierarchy. It's too sophisticated for him at that point. I have to start just by telling him what objects are. Well, essentially, I think that's the model for almost all of education today, is jumping right to the top of the hierarchy, telling kids words. Now, if we could imagine that I can get, you all know that kids go through that parrot stage where they just repeat things back to you. Well, I could, if I worked on it and actually had this as a goal, get him to parrot back things like Newton's laws to me. I could get him to memorize them and say them back to me. Is that knowledge? Is that any use to him? Is that impressive that he can do that? Does it make him more interested in the world around him? Does it make him more enthusiastic? No, it's complete nonsense that I'm teaching him to perform for me. That's basically what all of education has become. Now, I'm going to give you lots of examples to try to concretize this principle. But first, let me ask you, let's just start with science. How many of you loved high school biology? 2, 3, 4. Okay. How many of you were not so keen on high school biology? Okay. Now, next question I'll ask you is, what do you remember from high school biology? Just throw out some... Well, your first response is not a heck of a lot. Yeah, that's usually what happens if you are teaching in a non-hierarchical method. But what's something you do remember? Okay. Yes?
Our teacher wanted us to read a book about Ebola to freak us out.
Okay, so, and what do you remember? What is Ebola?
A disease.
It's a disease. Can you tell me anything more about it than that?
No.
No? Okay, well, what we usually find, or you might actually know something about that. I can't use my own teachers as guinea pigs for this process. What about DNA? Did you learn about DNA? Okay, what is DNA? Not you.
Double helix.
It's a double helix. What's the helix? What does that mean? Yeah?
It's the structure.
It's the structure. The structure of what? What is that actually made out of?
Genes.
Genes. What are genes? But what are genes? What are the genes made out of? Nucleotides. Who here knows what a nucleotide is? No. So
Series of chemicals.
chemicals. Okay, now you might actually know something. But for most of us, we took a lot of tests about DNA and about genes and about, I didn't have to take one on Ebola, but we took a lot of tests with very sophisticated, fancy-sounding, complex technical language. But what did we actually know about it? And it has been powerfully informative to me to really stop and think about what I know and what is just pretty empty verbiage that I can kind of parrot, just like I would be getting Seth to do. And it's actually a little disturbing, too. When I've given this lecture in the past, I've had people come up and feel simultaneously inspired and completely devastatingly depressed because it helps to really understand this principle, and it's empowering. It helps you to understand how to educate your own children, and it helps you to reflect on your own education. But it also makes you realize how vacuous much of your own education was and how much of what seems like knowledge in your head is not really knowledge but empty language. Hi, Gracie. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Now, who here has heard my hierarchy lecture from? Okay, only. Okay, so I am going to share a couple examples from that lecture because they're just perfect, wonderful, classic, timeless examples. Starting with my story of Kevin and protein synthesis. So Kevin is a former student of mine who graduated from VanDamme Academy, or the little home school that was VanDamme Academy back then, went on to high school and was having difficulty in high school biology. So he came back to be tutored by one of the teachers, my ex-husband, Tom. So Tom was teaching him, and his assignment of the night was to study for a test on protein synthesis. So Tom starts quizzing him on the formulations in his notes. And these formulations involve messenger RNA and deoxyribonucleic acid and ribosomal subunits and base pairings and so on and so on. So he effectively got all of it memorized. He could recite the process of protein synthesis. And he was going to do really well on his test. At the conclusion of this discussion, when he had mastered it and he was ready for the test, Tom said, "Kevin, what's a protein?" And Kevin said, "I have no idea." So he could recite recite words to describe protein synthesis, but he had no clue what the thing was that was being synthesized. So it's tragic how much of our education is on that model, that we're able to perform and recite and regurgitate, but really have no understanding of what we're talking about. My own daughter, Lana, just had this experience at high school. She came back from school with a homework assignment to learn about ATP, the currency of biological energy. Okay, the currency of biological energy. Now, one thing I want you to notice, because this is also often a tip-off of a hierarchy violation, is the use of metaphors. Often we're using metaphors because we can't really explain what's going on. So the currency of biological energy, what does the currency mean? We're talking about money here? I don't understand how that language figures in here. Well, it's a substitute for a real explanation of what's going on. Now, I remember the lesson perfectly well. I could ace the test on the currency of biological energy. Here's what she was sent home with a video. It was a Khan Academy video, so this was supposed to be an expert presentation of this concept, and it's very visual, so it's compelling and it's memorable, and so this would really help the kids learn about ATP. Well, in one sense it was effective, because I can now tell you that ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And so what happens in the production of energy is you have adenosine, A, with a circle around it. And then you have 3 phosphates, 3 P's with circles around them. Okay? Then you have an equals sign, and that equals is the process of the ATP being hydrolyzed, which means you write H2O and you draw an arrow to the equal sign, because that's what's happening right there. It's being hydrolyzed. Then the result is you have, I've got this right so far, right? Some of you know this. Then you have adenosine diphosphate, because what you've done when you hydrolyzed it is you broke off one of the phosphates. So now you have an A with a circle around it, 2 P's with a circle around it, and energy. I get an A, right? What's adenosine? I don't know. What's a phosphate? I have no idea. What does it mean to be hydrolyzed? No clue. What do we mean when we're talking about biological energy? I don't really know. So I don't know anything about what I just told you. It was pure, memorized nonsense gibberish. And really, what it amounts to, in my mind, is 3 A's with circles. Wait, did I say that backwards? 1 A with a circle, 3 P's, an equal sign, an arrow, and then some more. So that's all that it amounts to. Now, does that sound familiar to you as from your own science education? Okay, so let's just take a minute to think about how completely absurd this is. What is science? Science is supposed to be unlocking the physical world around us, explaining things, making us informed, making us capable of making good judgments about our functioning in the physical world. It's supposed to train us in a habit of mind and a system of thought and observation that will lead us to certain intelligible, solid conclusions. This is doing exactly the opposite. It's not training me in a thinking method. It's training me in nothing more than pure, empty memorization. It's not explaining anything about the world around me. On the contrary, it's explaining nothing at all. So it is not only an absurdity that you're not actually learning anything about science or about the physical world, it's actually undermining your whole capability of doing science in a meaningful way. So let me see if I need to give any other examples. I mean, really, it's kind of shocking and horrifying to think about how many of the basics of a biology education fit into this category. So let's take something like Newton's laws. How many of you learned Newton's laws in school? Okay. Newton's laws are taught like they were written on stone tablets. They just come out of the blue one day. They're on page 54 in your textbook, and there they are. And they tell you the formulation of his 3 laws. They give you formulas associated with them, and then you do problems with those formulas. Well, it wasn't until I took a history of science course from someone who deeply respected the principle of hierarchy that I learned the sequence of discoveries and new knowledge and new integrations with those discoveries, and over the course of human history, basically, that led us that led to Newton's finally synthesizing everything, all of those discoveries, into these simple, fundamentally explicable laws of the behavior of physical objects. If you follow that historical sequence, then you really understand those principles. You understand what they explain. You have to have questions that arise before you can have a complicated formula to answer them. You understand where people went wrong and what mistakes they made and what obstacles they faced where things didn't fit in and integrate into a coherent picture. And then how his laws and observations synthesized all of that into something totally consistent. So just notice how many things are taught as if they just come out of the blue. There's no historical sequence behind them. There's no building of knowledge step by step to these broad generalizations. Everything is treated like it's on the same plane. It's not. So any questions about that, or any stories from your own experience or ways that you can relate to this principle? Yes?
My kids used to go to public school, and luckily they're here now. If I took my son out in 3rd grade, but if he had gone into 4th grade, the history they would have learned at that time would have been the missions of California.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to tell my friends who have kids in public schools what's different about VanDamme. And I give them that example.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm like, what have they learned before that makes this significant? So they go, oh, yeah. They start thinking about that.
Right.
So it just comes out of the blue. It's like, okay, we're studying this.
Right, and that's a different sort of example because it's sometimes easier to see when we're talking about complex technical jargon that we don't, but it's true for anything. There should be a context that makes the learning of this meaningful, and a context that this integrates into that makes why you're learning this intelligible.
And the funny thing is, up until 4th grade, at least in my experience, there's no history.
Mm-hmm.
It's not taught at all.
So then you're jumping to a late period in human history. Yeah. Okay, so how is science taught properly? Well, just come in and sit on a class with Mr. Wren or Mr. Krieger. It's taught, I can't obviously tell you right here and now in simple terms how it's taught properly, because how it's taught properly is a complex task that they are scrupulously working on all the time, because there is no textbook that they can follow that lays out science hierarchically. And they're not natural-born experts in all areas of science. They had to educate themselves largely in these fields. But how many of you have seen the chicken foot and the cell video that I did on YouTube? No? Okay, good. So what I explained is that typically if you open a biology textbook, elementary biology textbook, what you see on the first page is a picture of a cell. Now imagine a kid looking around at the biological world. Is a cell the first thing he encounters? No. Is it something that it took hundreds and hundreds of years for us to encounter at all? Yes. Okay? I didn't really understand what was interesting or valuable about the discovery of the cell until I read a book called Microbe Hunters, which I highly recommend if anyone's interested in biology, which was about the discovery of cells and how empowering the knowledge was and how fascinating a discovery it was at the time. This was in the 1600s, is that right? Okay. 1600s, that's a lot of science had gone on before that. So this is not the first thing that kids encounter. I think it probably starts with a cell in the textbook because it's small. So we're just starting with something small and moving to things that are bigger, but there is no reason for that. So what Mr. Krieger, a few years ago, what he did on the first day of school, or close to the first day of school, was to ask the kids to feel their hands. That's how they started. Now that is a hierarchical approach to science. Start with something that is accessible to them, observable to them, part of their immediate daily environment, and look at it. So he's teaching them an intellectual habit, and they're looking at something that can be explained and accessible to them. So they felt their hand. Do it. look how much you can notice just by feeling your hand. You can notice that there's a bone here and a hinge right here, and something about the shape of the bones, and then you notice there's a funny feeling kind of material right in here, and it's amazing how much you can observe that you may never have before if you just start feeling your hand. So, and having that attitude that I'm going to learn everything I can about the hand just by feeling it. And then you want to know more, so this is when historically people would sneak into tombs and start dissecting cadavers so they could really look inside that hand and see what was going on. But anyway, so they would start with that, and then he brought in chicken's feet for the kids. And they started dissecting the chicken's feet, and then they could look at the anatomy. It's anatomically basically the same, very close. So then they could look at what those things were that they were feeling inside of their hands. Not only that, the chicken's feet had these nice tendons hanging right out of the bottom, and they could pull those, and guess what happened? Okay? So then they know, ooh, when I pull the tendons at the bottom of the foot, so that must be somehow what's going on inside of my hand. And seriously, part of the reason I tell this story again and again is that afternoon, two things happened. I saw kids walking out of class going, okay? So enthusiasm, interest in the world around them, observant. This was really cool. They knew something about their hand now. Second, I had to write a note to parents some of you may have received saying, please check your child's backpack for a chicken foot because it might start to smell if you don't catch that it's in there, because they all wanted to bring it home to share with their parents. So that was informative, accessible, hierarchically appropriate knowledge that, for that reason, was meaningful and exciting to them, something they wanted to share with you, something they really cared about. And that is a small example of why that principle animates the curriculum across the board. Let's see. Any questions about that? Do any of you have kids who come home and talk about science? Is science one that... Yeah, I know yours do. Any lessons you remember in particular then being excited about?
They love the chicken.
They love the chicken.
But today Sam was ecstatic over the owl bones.
Oh, yes.
That's what they were. Mouse bones from an owl. He raved about it, and he's very happy.
Mr. Krieger, would you like to briefly explain this lesson?
We recently finished talking about the human skeleton, and we did a quick comparison of animal skeletons, and I thought it would be nice if they could have a little skeleton of their own to look at and maybe practice, seeing if they can recognize the bones and maybe assemble one. And you can get such a thing from a regurgitated owl pellet. They swallow their mouths whole, digest the soft bits, compact the fur and the bones into a little pellet, and regurgitate it. And science companies collect them, wrap them in foil, and sell them to me, and I can...
So you get to be a little mini archaeologist digging bones out. I came into the office today. Mr. Krieger was pulling apart an owl pellet at his desk, and I just went over and started watching over his shoulder. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's accessible. Yes?
What's nice is my son explained it exactly like that, because he's explained to me that he's got a pellet, and I'm like, why is Mr. Krieger having you dissect poop?
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
He explained exactly the same
He
thing.
explained, and it was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I said, did you wash it? And I was like, Mom, it's not.
it's not poop. I have seen owl pellets in the Delta Science catalog for years, and I thought that's what it was the whole time. I never understood that this was. So it's did they just hold it in some pocket?
They weren't initially part of the curriculum, but he did it with his students this year, and I thought, cool, that fits in great, I'm going to do it too.
Okay, and were they able to identify bones from the?
Yeah,
A little bit?
My students are mostly the older kids, and they did a pretty good job of it, especially the ones that are very similar to the human body. They
Okay.
do very well.
Did anybody hear about the cow's eye dissection? Yeah? Okay. That was another exciting one. And I came in to observe a class of Mr. Rins today. And I was in there, for like 5, 10, maybe 10 minutes. And in that time, I saw many beautiful examples of the consequence of hierarchical teaching, because he would ask them questions that were anticipating something, like what is doing this to the lens going to do to the focal length? And based on other observations they had made with lenses and talking about cameras, and they were able to anticipate that next step. So that's another indication of a proper approach to science, is that they can put pieces together and look forward to the next step in a way that makes sense to them without just having to be told the answer. They have the tools in place to make those integrations. Okay, so science is one of the, it's interesting because hierarchy seems obvious in something like math, right? If we boasted that we teach our kids calculus in kindergarten, would that make you really excited? No, you would think, what are they doing? That doesn't make any sense. You need to know a little arithmetic and algebra before you can get to something like calculus. So still people violate hierarchy in absurd ways in math, but I won't go into those right now. The whole new math phenomenon was just one big hierarchy inversion. But it seems more obvious to most people in math or something like grammar. We can't go into what an adverbial noun is. Anyone know what an adverbial noun is? See, I'm just showing off right now. One guy knows. Okay. We can't go into what an adverbial noun or an elliptical clause. We can't. That's what he's teaching right now, I happen to know. So we can't teach elliptical clauses if they don't know parts of speech, sentences, clauses, the difference between clauses and phrases. There's a whole sequence of knowledge that they need to know before they can get to something as sophisticated as elliptical clauses. So in certain subjects, it seems fairly inescapable. But then in science, interestingly, it's not always noticed how terrible a hierarchy violation most of the teaching is, and I think in part that's because none of us ever really learned science. We don't really know what science is. We don't know what it means to do science. Most of the people I know who are scientists view most of their education as hoops they had to jump through, and then their real knowledge came in practice. That's usually true. Would you say that's true for medicine? I would say, I hear this in engineering a lot, that, engineers, there's a lot of abstract jargon that they memorize, and then it's on the job that they get the practical training that integrates with the knowledge they have that makes it come into real understanding. So let's switch to a subject like history and how hierarchy is violated in history. Well, I can go to my classic example from poor Kevin again, and another assignment that Tom was tutoring him on. So in this assignment, he was asked to read 4 arguments for and 4 arguments against laissez-faire capitalism. And then he had to formulate an opinion of his own about laissez-faire capitalism. Was he for it or against it? So he read these arguments, and then they were talking through the information and he was trying to help Kevin to formulate his position. And Kevin said, well, didn't they try laissez-faire capitalism once in France? And Tom's retort at the time was, under which king or emperor did they try laissez-faire capitalism? So the point is, reading 4 arguments for or 4 arguments against something out of context does not give you an informed opinion about it. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of people treat the newspaper. But you're not actually informed if you don't know the history of politics and the consequence of politics and the types of government and what the world was like under those governments. That's why we're learning history. We're trying to learn. It's like this huge laboratory of experience, and we get to look at it and see, well, when you do this, when these principles are put in place, what happens? What's life like? What's important? What are the values of this time? how wealthy or poor is the culture of that time? What are they focused on outside of, what are the basic values in their day-to-day lives? Okay, all of these things are things we study so that we can be informed about judgments on current political events or politics or any broad cultural issues. So another silly example I have of this is from my own daughter's experience in going to high school this year, and just a little warm-up exercise that the teacher used to do with them. So this was a consistent day-to-day exercise. He would put something up on the board, like a map of Europe, and say, guess what route the plague took through Europe? Guess what route the plague took through Europe? So they would have to take their little tablets and their styluses and draw a route. Based on what? Absolutely nothing. Had they talked about the plague? No. Did they know anything about the political, cultural, health conditions? No. They knew nothing, but they're guessing a route. Mr. Lewis is in agony over there. And then he would say, nope, and tell them what the route actually was. No. This could be an interesting exercise if he had set them up with knowledge that they could bring to bear on the question and somehow piece it together and do this Sherlock exercise figuring out what route the plague must have taken through Europe. No, that's not what it was. So, but it's just kind of a silly example, but it's reflective of the larger approach, that there's just information that I'm giving you, not knowledge built slowly, piece by piece, so that you can draw broader conclusions of your own. It's just information. So the principle of hierarchy is why you will never see a mock election at this school, for example. We're not asking the kids to vote on the propositions or to choose the next president. And the reason we're not doing that is we don't believe they should. We believe it should be a decision that's informed, and the way it's informed is you learn history. So the proper approach to history, now again, we don't have a textbook we can go grab that lays out history in a totally intelligible, accessible, hierarchical way. Much of this we've had to do from scratch, somewhat drawing upon influences maybe from the previous century when they seem to have a better approach. But what does history look like at VanDamme Academy? Well, it starts in kindergarten just with little stories that orient them to the different time periods. So if they're studying the Middle Ages, they learn about what was life like for a child in the Middle Ages. What were the living conditions for people? What kinds of things did they eat? What kinds of things did they wear? They might learn about major historical figures, not big abstract themes or evaluations of those figures or cause and effect stories about what they did and what the consequences were, just exposure. So, and as much as possible of things that are simple and directly accessible to them. Then, when they get to Mr. Steele's level of history, the second through fifth grade, then you can start telling more stories. You can start making it a little more causal and explanatory and really getting into the stories of, well, what was the government like at this time? What were the principles of this government? Where was power held and how did that work? What were the consequences? What was life like for people at this time? And show a relationship among those things. Now, at Mr. Steele's level, he's largely focusing more on the influential figures of that time and telling their stories and things that capture more about the nature and essence of those time periods. Then when they get to Mr. Lewis's level, then they can really start putting all this information, these pieces together into a coherent cause and effect story over the course of the whole year, a story that starts on the first day and continues every day after that. Now, when I reflect on social studies class, even just the word social studies class elicits a giggle. Well, what do you remember about social studies class? If I tell you what I really remember, it'll be a little bit embarrassing. But what I really remember is my teacher throwing me his watch and saying, "You can look at this instead of looking at the clock, so I won't have to watch you look at the clock." Or, could somebody check Lisa's IV, because I want to make sure she's not dead. So I hated social studies. I hated it. It seemed so out of context and meaningless and memorization driven. I was just given a lot of abstract information, and I had to be able to recite it back on the test. Was that the experience for most of you?
I guess everyone read. We put on a mock trial for Christopher Columbus for the crimes of humanity.
Okay. Because you, fourth grader, have the authority to judge. Well, I grew up in Albany, New York, which is known for being the center of liberalism. I mean, it's just purely liberal. And yet we would do these exercises where we would fill in bubbles that would tell us at the end whether we were liberal or conservative. Well, guess what? All of us were liberal because all we did is repeat back what we heard at home. I mean, we don't have any context to have any actual judgment on these political issues, but maybe we heard Mom say something about this. So it was really absurd. I remember sending some of our students off to high school and looking at the course catalogs, and I'm sure things have not changed, but there was a freshman class. I think this is still true. They have one of the freshman classes is something called World Cultures. And part of the description that I read, this was years ago, said that they were going to they're going to form their own thesis about how to resolve the Arab-Palestinian conflict. So freshman year, assuming that they have no knowledge of history because they don't know anything about this school, they're supposed to walk in the door and solve the Arab-Palestinian conflict. Okay, so aside from not teaching them a methodology, it's also teaching them your opinion is sacred, because there doesn't need to be a foundation for it. It doesn't need to be built from the ground up solidly with knowledge and information justifying that conclusion, because the whole model of your learning has been you're thrown an abstraction and you catch it and recite it back for the test. That's all you're expecting to do in your own thinking or expressing of your ideas or beliefs. I often will have kids transfer into if they transfer into the school at junior high level and they're in one of my classes, sometimes this makes us giggle, but someone will always express an opinion because they're in the habit of just voicing an opinion. It doesn't really have to be substantiated. It's just their opinion. It's sacred. And so they'll come into my class and they'll make an assertion about the book, and I'll either say, "Where did you get that idea?" Point to the information in the book that from which you drew that conclusion, which always takes them a little bit aback. Wait, I have to justify this. Or sometimes I'll say no, and that's usually really, really shocking to them. Wait, there's a no when we're talking about literature? Yes, there's a no. It has to be actually in the text. If it's not in the text, it's not true. So, I mean, if it's not implied by the text, and you have to be able to justify that implication. Okay, so the proper approach to teaching history means that they are deeply informed about the major political events in the history. The basic standard that we use is the major events forwards or backwards in the path that led to the development of the United States. That's the basic standard for the history curriculum. And so they actually know that story. I mean, first of all, it's treated like Newton's laws come out of the blue, like they're written on stone tablets. This whole country is treated like it came out of the blue. Kids are, because they're not informed of history and because they're raised in this quite free and prosperous time, they have no idea that there was actually a path that led to that. They haven't learned about Greek democracy. They haven't learned about the development of law in Rome. They haven't learned about what happened in the Middle Ages. They haven't learned all of the major formative events that they haven't learned about the Industrial Revolution and how much that transformed the whole experience of living in this world. So it's so easy to just take the life they have for granted and not recognize all the pieces that went into the development of the principles that underlie this country. I overheard an amusing conversation between two 8th graders the other day. How did this come up? How did the dictatorship comment come up? You don't remember? Oh, you weren't there for it. Okay, so I can't remember how it came up, but one of the students said, well, a dictatorship would be the best kind of government, or a dictatorship would be the best kind of government. And one of my other students wheeled around at him, looked at him in the eye, kind of shocked, and then said, for the dictator. Now, it was a cute retort, and I enjoyed that aspect of it. But more importantly, the reason he wheeled around like that and looked at him in the eye is he knows what a dictatorship means. He's learned about it in history. It's easy to just throw about the term and imagine this kind of idealistic vision of this kind and paternalistic leader taking care of us all.
That was the point. He said if the dictator was benevolent.
If the dictator was benevolent, sure. But for the student who made this retort, the reality of what dictatorship has looked like in the course of history was inescapable for him. And that is the kind of context that I want the students to have and bring to bear on these conversations. So it's not just spouting theories that have kind of a vague meaning to them, but having real substance and understanding behind it. Yes?
I think it's worth pointing out that the student who thought a dictatorship was a good thing was a student that joined us very recently. And the student who...
Right, so he didn't, and I mean, Mr. Cobra and I discussed our theories of where he got this idea, because I'm sure it was from an innocent source, it's easy to make sound intelligible if you know nothing about history. And you have to know nothing about history. Okay, let's see, what else should I focus on? Yes?
I wanted to share a story of how the history curriculum goes from particular stories up to larger principles.
That'd be great.
Last year, I taught all my classes, but I taught the 3rd grade class about European history, especially the English Middle Ages, and of course, Runnymede and the Magna Carta came up, and I explained it to them as a story that they could very easily understand, that the barons were upset with the way the king was acting, that he was putting taxes on them they didn't agree to, that he was giving them instructions they didn't like, so they organized a bit of a rebellion to force the king to follow certain rules, and they wrote down those rules in the Magna Carta. Then this year, I was talking to them about the founding of the 13 colonies, and I got to the story of Connecticut, where one man was upset with the way things were in Massachusetts. He left to go to start a new colony in Connecticut, and he wrote down a constitution listing all the grievances that he didn't like, that there were term limits because he didn't like how people could be in office forever. It guaranteed the vote to all religions because he didn't like that Massachusetts only gave the vote in office holding to certain religious sects. And one of my students, I was very pleased that they were able to remember this. They looked at those two events side by side and said, well, was Thomas Hooker inspired by the Magna Carta? So there we see that it's a variety of stories that are told at the level that they can understand, usually revolving around individual characters, that they can understand the from those individual stories, they can start to see larger principles that are animating history, the desire to secure freedom and limit tyranny or other sources of.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great example. And it also shows the parallel with the science that we were discussing, that they're able to anticipate something because they're putting a lot of information together and then making an inference.
There's one more addendum I wanted to add to that, that I could then go on to say that it was the English colonies that were developing these practices because of the tradition of limited government in England, whereas the Spanish colonies, they were still on the feudal model because that had never changed. So there's plenty of time for plenty of room to integrate all of these trends that they had been learning because they're learning history as a sequence. And we focus on individual stories that illustrate certain ideas and principles.
Yeah, so the hierarchical approach makes it intelligible to them. It makes it retainable to them. It makes it meaningful and interesting to them. And again, this explains all those qualities that you see your kids bringing home. Sometimes when new parents come or kids come to visit the school, I'll ask them, what are you learning in history? And then I have to catch myself and say, what are you learning in social studies? Well, but I'll say, what are you learning in history? And they'll look at me blankly. And that's when I remember, okay, what are you learning in social studies? But then they still look at me blankly because they usually don't really know. There's not really an answer to that. What are we learning in social studies? Well, yesterday we had to name all the missions. It's just some isolated information out of context, not part of a story, not meaningful to them, and they just have to memorize it to do well on the test. One observation that Lana made when she went to high school this year is that her peers hated English class, and they loved science and wasn't history. Science and maybe it was their social studies class. And she said the reason that they liked the classes they did was that they knew exactly what they had to do to succeed. Because that's all it was about, was succeeding. It wasn't about understanding, it was about performing. And they knew exactly what they had to do because they just had to memorize it. And as long as they put in the effort and dedication to memorize it, they could get a perfect score on the test. Whereas in English, they actually had to think. They actually had to generate. They had to create. And that was unfamiliar to them as a pattern in their education and intimidating to them. And there was no guaranteed mastery. So that's the extent to which this methodology has come to dominate education. It is almost exclusively memorization-based. And part of it is that, so I've heard it said many times that in science we have to keep them up on the latest and greatest cutting-edge information. Well, science is really complicated and technical and very subdivided into areas of specialty. We can't keep them up on the latest and greatest cutting-edge information. And the latest, at this point in human history, the latest and greatest cutting-edge information is really, really abstract and complicated and technical. So the more we feel obligated to do that, the more we're just throwing at them a bunch of stuff to be memorized. And the more we're undermining there being any latest and greatest innovations. Okay, I think I'll go into one more subject area, my own personal area of expertise. Literature. Anybody want to try to guess how hierarchy applies to literature? I'll give you a minute. I know you're scared of me, but.
I can tell you a way it doesn't apply.
Okay.
So my son went to a school that was a great school, and it was kindergarten, and he was an advanced reader in kindergarten. And they had this program of AR reading, and they graded things by reading level.
Okay.
And every week they had to go into the library and pick a book based on this reading level. And by the end of the week, they had to test on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And so my son was in 5th grade reading. So he picked out some pretty advanced books. And this one book, which I don't want to go into, was by the time he brought it home to read it at home, it was so heartbreaking. Yeah, there was a very difficult book that Mr. Steele just taught about a boy who had to survive on his own. It was something like that.
Hatchet.
Yeah, but Max is in 5th grade now.
He was in
There
kindergarten.
was context and discussion that went around this.
Yeah.
And so he was asking me questions about what certain things meant and what these meant, and he was crying. And he went and he took the test, and he got an A. And I thought, and then at the end of the year, he got an award for reading 55,000 words.
All right.
And I thought, how in the world did they know this? Like, it's because they count the words depending on this thing. I was like, this is not the right way.
Yeah, so he wasn't relating in a meaningful way that was inspiring to him with that literature. He was getting it done and then performing back on the test. Well, that's actually a really good example, and I think one of our biggest challenges as a school is finding literature that is hierarchically appropriate for any particular age. Hierarchically appropriate means the language is accessible to them. More importantly, it means the themes are accessible and appropriate for them. So I will tell you right here and now that I am passionately, adamantly, completely against children's version of the classics. There is no such thing as a children's version of the classic. If it's for children, it's not the classic. They had to rewrite it so that it was accessible to children. You will see children's versions of Gulliver's Travels. Well, it's got big people and little people, so it's an interesting story for kids. No, it's a social, like satirical social commentary. That's what these big people and little people are used for. So if you make it just about big people and little people, then it's like an adventure tale for kindergartners. It's not Gulliver's Travels. So I strongly, strongly discourage you from, in the name of making them literate and able to really show off at cocktail parties, making them read children's classics. So what we're looking for, the perfect example, Victor Hugo, some of you know, is my very favorite author. He has only a handful of novels, and I just devoured them as an adult. One of my favorites is The Hunchback of Notre Dom. How many of you have read The Hunchback of Notre Dom? Okay, just a few. The day I heard that they were making a Disney version of The Hunchback of Notre Dom, I almost died. The Hunchback of Notre Dome is largely about a priest tortured by passion for a gypsy girl, tortured by lust for a gypsy girl. Disney movie? And so what they do, there's actually a picture of him a song with him writhing in flames in the Disney movie, so I think it's just kind of vaguely alluded to. But largely they make it into the story of Beauty and the Beast. That's what The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, poor Victor Hugo should be rolling over in his grave at the idea of The Hunchback of Notre Dame being Beauty and the Beast. It's just a travesty. So it's the children's versions of the classics just extract certain features of the story that are prominent and then turn it into a children's story. So our challenge is to find very well-crafted, beautifully written works of literature with accessible and age-appropriate themes. And I think we've got quite a good library, and we're really getting toward the ideal collection for that purpose. But I still feel like I learn every year what is accessible to them and what is not accessible to them. And sometimes things are a bit of a stretch. So, give you an example. I'm teaching Shane to the 7th graders right now, and I taught it also to the 8th graders. Who hasn't heard of the novel Shane? It's a short novel written in relatively simple language, set in the Wild West, basically, and about somebody who is a gunslinger fleeing his past and trying to defend a group of homesteaders against the ranchers who are trying to drive them off their land. Well, the character of Shane, the language is very accessible. It's a highly readable book in a certain sense, but what I discovered in trying to teach it is that I was drawing so many inferences out of that language that the kids were not capable of making on their own. So I would be continually shocked at what they didn't understand without me guiding them through it and really showing them how a certain conclusion followed from what was implied in the text. Well, so that's one problem. But another problem is simply relating to the values in the novel. And the one that I found particularly amusing this year is Shane is this character of total moral integrity. I mean, that is essentially the story, is him and his impeccable character. And the relationship he forms with Joe, the homesteader, the friendship that they form, and the total devotion and trust and respect that they have for each other. Well, Joe is a married man, and Shane and Joe's wife just develop feelings for each other. Shane is a great man. You can't blame anyone for developing feelings for him, and vice versa. So the kids, I discovered, thought they had revered him up until that point. Now he's terrible. Why is he terrible? Because he had feelings for this other man's wife. And it was sort of took me aback, and I had to say, well, wait a second. Did he act on those feelings? What did he do? How did he behave? What moral responsibility does he have for feelings that he develops? And their conduct is flawless, again, both of them. So that's a sophisticated point, and it didn't occur to me that it was going to be difficult for them to understand. This is a really adult sort of situation for them to understand. So I'd still teach it, but I realize that I have to anticipate that and make very clear and explicit why they can develop feelings for each other and still be the morally impeccable characters that they had been led to believe they were up until that point. Let's see. Similar example of them having difficulty relating to kind of the adult values in the story. When I taught the Hunchback of Notre Dom once years ago, there's a empty, philandering character who you're supposed to regard as just the kind of empty, worthless playboy. And at one point, he kisses Esmeralda. Now, at a certain point, we were discussing the different types of love illustrated in this story. And this character, Phoebus, I said, well, Phoebus, does he love Esmeralda, who's just one of his 25 conquests that he doesn't really care a thing for? And they said, yep. Yes? Well, yeah, he kissed her. So for them, that kissing means love. And so he kissed her, therefore he must love her. So a subtlety of adult human experience that I had to really help them with for it to be accessible to them. So sometimes I have that happen and just decide, okay, bump that to high school literature and then go home and cry because I can't teach it. But often it just means anticipating that and planning and helping to bring things out earlier in the story that will allow them to understand that point when they arrive at it in the story. Any questions about teaching literature? Mm-hmm.
Because Mary loves those children's versions of classics.
No, don't do it.
I
really discourage it. But I'll tell you the other reason I discourage it. You can run the titles by me. If it's Shakespeare, let her go for it. Because Shakespeare stories always end the same way. So it's not, Shakespeare stories can be turned into kind of Greek mythology type feeling stories. But so I say that because one of my major objections is that to the extent that it actually resembles the original, you're blowing the story for them. So then when they get to be an adult, they already know how it ends. And I just have had so many magical, I'm watching it right now, my 8th graders are reading Gone with the Wind, and you should see them coming on, what? I can't believe that. I mean, they're just blown away. They haven't seen the movie. Even if they had seen the movie, there's so much in the novel that they wouldn't have seen, but they are so excited by the twists and turns in the plot, and I wouldn't want to rob them of that experience. And I've had so many experiences like that myself with literature that to the extent I can, I like to preserve that for them, for their adulthood. But I guess, so just give me the list of titles and I'll tell you the ones that are off limits because she has to read them later. Because, what's that?
It may be too late.
It may be too late. It's okay. There will still be a lot to get out of them because remember, they don't really resemble the original. So it'll give away the major plot twist, but the rest will be preserved. One other thing I was going to say about that. I guess I was going to suggest something and then realized I don't have anything to follow up on the suggestion because I was going to say it's so much better. I mean, it's not, aside from the giving away the plot, it's not destructive to read those, but it's so much better to read something that has age-appropriate values. And I'm sure, some of the kids just read Edward Tulane. They are just moved, deeply moved by those stories. And it's so rewarding and fun to see little kids moved by the stories because they really relate to the values that are being projected. So I would prefer for her to have that experience reading, but then beyond our library, I don't have very many books to recommend. So that can be a bit of a problem too.
Just to follow up, do you have the same comment about abridged books?
Depends. Because even, forgive me, Victor Hugo, I want to abridge his novels. So it depends on the author because Victor Hugo has lengthy, irrelevant historical passages, which are particularly painful for an American audience because we are so ignorant of history. So they're not necessary to the novel at all. I mean, there's 93, maybe, I guess Les Miserables is my favorite. 93 would be second. And 93 has a huge chunk, the convention, that can just be extracted from the book and change nothing. The plot is completely the same because it's just a digression into the Marat, Danton, Robespierre interaction. And I'm sure for people at the time, that was really fascinating in and of itself, but it's fascinating and unrelated to the story. So Hugo, yeah, have at it. But they're not abridged well, so that's a danger with reading the abridged versions. And then there's some that it would be a positive crime to abridge. Even, interestingly, I think it would be a crime to abridge Gone with the Wind. That 1,000-page book, the experience we're having is that every single page and every character is completely integrated into the theme. So I wouldn't want to miss a second of it.
So you can get mad at me.
Okay.
But Ilana and I always read different novels.
Mm-hmm.
And when she was a couple of years ago, I loved The Little Princess.
Uh-huh.
And I found what I thought was a pretty good abridged version of
Okay.
it that basically simplified the language,
Uh-huh.
preserved all of the character in the story,
Yeah.
in the plot of it. So I read it to her.
Uh-huh.
She loved it.
Uh-huh.
She loved the character of Sarah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she just felt so. I suggested Secret Garden. Now I
Okay.
have an abridged version of it with the same person.
So you're asking my permission?
No.
Oh.
Because
I was going to say no.
She chose not to
She did.
She wanted to read the full real version because she loved the story so much.
Good. So what it sounds like to me in that situation is they did a good job of writing a new book of The Little Princess and maybe stealing the parts of the actual, or of the Secret Garden. Stealing, wait, you did the Little Princess or the Secret? You did the Little Princess. Okay, so stealing the great plot situation and then writing a good book for kids of her age. But the original is really, really, really good. And that is, I'm sure that they did a good job of it, but I'm sure it's nothing like the original because it is just so exquisitely beautifully written. And I'm sure there are details of characterization that aren't in the original. So good for her. Save the other one. Yes.
So this may be just a request that you're like, oh, maybe not. But
Okay.
Ms. Greengold was here in between school years. She'd hand out a reading list.
Yeah.
And it really helped my son to have a passion for reading because he loves to read.
Yeah.
But when he was reading just whatever,
Yeah.
In between, it was meaningless.
That is a request that I will not dismiss, but have a difficult time honoring. Because Mrs. Greengold's list was her own list, and I was happy for her to distribute it, but I wouldn't put the VanDamme Academy name on it, because we're really selective about what sorts of things we want to reflect the school, and to say, this is the kind of literature we want your kids reading.
But aren't the books that you teach, they're tied to the curriculum for the year?
Not necessarily,
Oh,
no.
Okay.
And now that we have one class per grade, there are certain books that are becoming grade specific. Like this one, no matter what the curriculum year, they are going to read this book in this year. So for example, Cyrano de Bergerac for 8th grade, Miracle Worker for 7th grade. Does not matter what year we are in, 7th graders will be reading the Miracle Worker and the 8th graders will be reading Cyrano de Bergerac.
So you go to Amazon and you read the reviews and you think, oh, this is going to be a good book. And then you get it and you're like, wow.
I think that we should pool our resources here and try to, I know that I've given Miss Blum and Mr. Steele and Mrs. Watkins, I think, are going through a list of, was it the New York Times that? No.
Yeah, but I've written down the back. One of those.
That was NPR.
NPR. NPR produced a list of recommended books for children, and I went through it, and I think 35 of them were part of our curriculum. So, of 100, 35 of 100. So I figured if that many were in our curriculum, there were probably some gems in the rest of that list, too. So,
Mrs. Watkins is one of those people who sits at Barnes & Noble for an hour in the children's section, and I purchase piles of books that I think might be good for us, and then I read them, and then come and say, this is good.
very rarely. Unfortunately. So let's brainstorm a way to get recommendations of things that we might not put into the curriculum, but that we would consider good, worthwhile reading for the kids for the summer. I think if I can just collect recommendations from all the parents. What's that?
The American Library Association.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've had mixed. That's definitely a good resource. But then we still have to go through the process of reading them ourselves and deciding by all these standards whether it fits into the curriculum. Yes, Mr. Krieger.
It occurred to me while you were speaking, you might be able to draw a pretty strong parallel between children's versions of the classics and people who want to give away the end of the story in science. I can imagine people looking at really big, great works of literature and saying, this is fantastic. We got to share this with kids. But in order to do it, you have to dumb it down.
Right.
And I think if you're going to ascribe any positive motives to the people who write modern science curriculum, question mark. But I can imagine some of them saying, look at these fabulous theories that we've developed that explain everything. We should share these with kids.
Right.
But in order to do it, you have to dumb it down. So in both cases, you're looking at
Greatness, a great achievement. Yeah.
But at an adult level, that's too far beyond. You have to go too far up the hierarchy to get there. How many try to share with kids? You have to dumb it down.
That's a very good point. And I think the problem is being compounded over the years. So I think education has degenerated very severely in the last couple of decades. And the problem gets compounded because if you are educated on the memorization model, then you yourself have no standard or filter for distinguishing real knowledge from memorized knowledge. And then that just makes things worse and worse over time. So, the people who are advocating it, on what model did they learn science or literature or anything else? Yes?
Mrs. Wolf's comments about Max when he was in kindergarten made me think about the way that we teach reading hierarchically in the Montessori room.
Mm-hmm.
So when I give tours to families, I love telling them about how we teach reading phonetically.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I learned when I came here that Lori taught me was that you learn to spell words before you read them. That's the way it's supposed to be done. Because in learning how to spell a word, you learn, all of the little rules about English spelling, which is completely crazy. And that way, once they learn how to spell the word and they know the rules, then when they come across a word they've never seen before, they can figure it out.
Yeah.
And I thought that was amazing when I first figured that out.
And another, correct me if I'm mistaken about this, Mrs. Beach, but another thing I remember learning about spelling with the movable alphabet before you read is that spelling with the mechanical alphabet before you write. Everybody knows what the movable alphabet is. It's just a big tray of plastic letters or wooden letters, and the kids will spell words with them. Well, they don't have to have the mechanics, the fine motor skills and the mechanics of writing prior to spelling. Well, that is a serious respect for a hierarchy, for what they're capable of and what they can master, and not requiring them to have mastered other skills that are actually more abstract and more difficult, or more even just physically difficult for them. And Montessori was a scientist of education, and one of the few, I think. She determined what was best for kids by watching them, by trying things, by observing what was successful, what did they respond to, what were they focused on, what allowed them to learn effortlessly, and studying it with this observant scientific approach made her develop materials that are just absolutely ingenious for teaching the fundamentals of math and reading. So reading becomes a seemingly effortless process for the kids because it's broken down into such sequential and incremental steps. So they master those steps and very simply, and they're building and building and building till they're reading and they don't even realize that they just learned how to read. So what's the opposite of that? Dog, and there's just the word dog written across it. Let's memorize a bunch of words, okay? That's trying to skip over hierarchically and not break it down. Just give them flashcards of words. The whole word method is definitely a hierarchy violation. Yes?
Just a little aside, if I can share something from
Sure.
vocabulary. With the younger kids, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, I'm starting a new program where I'm teaching them the words that they don't know from the books that they're reading. So it's so age appropriate in the sense that they can read most of what's in the novel, but when they come across a word they don't know, then we're going to build that as part of our vocabulary list. Second thing is that I break down the word into some of the syllables because when we're studying synonyms and antonyms, they start to see patterns between how, for example, IN can mean something's in something, or it can also mean not something. So I use that example for now. They can learn that, and then they'll apply it later the next time they see it, and then something starts to click in their mind. So it's not memorizing just words like, here's a bunch of letters, dog or cat or whatever, but it's understanding the parts of it. The same way that you would learn the phonetic sounds. Now you're learning this syllable on the prefix or the suffix without even saying those words to them. But they see it because it's becoming now familiar to them from the
Observing a pattern over time. And then they get to Mr. Phelan, and he teaches them all about the prefixes and the suffixes. Vocabulary is a good example for watching out for show-off education. I remember going to observe a school years and years ago, and I think it was a second grade class, and they were studying vocabulary. And what I still remember to this day, what was the first word on their vocabulary list? And I remember it because I had no idea what it was at the time. Campanile. Anyone ignorant like me don't know what campanile means? It's an Italian bell tower. Now, aren't they smarter than you because they knew what a campanile was and you don't know? But that's a good example. Yeah, show off information. Or how is that hierarchically inappropriate? Well, first of all, do they even know what Italy is? Probably not. Do they know what bell towers are or what they're for? It's just so remote from the life of a second grader that it's really inappropriate as a foundational language building word. But unfortunately, one of the selling points of the non-hierarchical method is that it looks fancy. It looks impressive. It looks like they know so much. And I do have to caution people about this because I've heard of conversations with VanDamme Academy students or students from another school where the students from the other school, when they're talking about science in particular, sound like they're so much more advanced than our kids. But what does advanced really mean? If it means they're memorizing that an atom has protons, neutrons, electrons, okay, but what does that actually mean to them in practice? Can they use that knowledge? Can they really explain what it means? Does it integrate with anything else they know? Then it's just, they went blah, 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 blah. That's all they did. So it's really important to appreciate the difference between sincere learning and just parroted syllables. Any other questions? So the basic theme here that I want you to come away with is that unfortunately, most of the world does not appreciate that there is a proper sequence to learning, but we do. And we are absolutely committed to the kids learning in a sequence that allows them to genuinely understand, appreciate, relate to, enjoy the material that they are learning. And that is why you're seeing them. It's an ongoing task, and I can't say we're perfect at it by any means. It's a really monumental undertaking since there are not materials that exist that follow this sequence. But to the extent we do, and we're always improving at it, that is why your kids are observant and enthusiastic about learning and passionate and are able to come home and explain things to you. All parents often tell me, my kids actually tell me about what they're learning. Well, part of that is their enthusiasm, but part of it is that they learned and they can tell you about it because they really understand it, so they're able to teach it and explain it to you as opposed to just sharing something they memorized in class earlier. So our loyalty to this principle is part of what explains all of those characteristics that you're seeing in your kids. And it's something we will remain committed to and help them to build their knowledge from the ground up so that it's truly theirs and truly means something to them. Yes?
Is there anywhere, I mean, you may not know, but is anywhere in the world, I mean, California school system is obviously not great. The U.S. school system is not great, but is there any country, is there any place that sort of still teaches in some kind of hierarchical way?
Poland? I think not that I know of. But I do think I think European schools tend to still be a little bit better. But yeah, I think that's all fallen apart. And I'd like to be more happy and optimistic. The greatest optimism I can offer is that it's really important to us and that kids who come through this program, and they have varying degrees of explicit understanding that has characterized their education, but they know the difference when they see it. They know when they're actually, even if it's just by feel, they know when they're learning something, when something is reasoned, when it's substantiated, when it's actual meaningful knowledge, and when it isn't. So that's my greatest hope, but am a little gloomy about what's going on outside of these walls, unfortunately. All we can do is keep promoting the right ideas. Any other questions? Well, if you have more later, it's a subject I always love to talk about, so just drop by the office anytime. Yes?
I had a fun story.
Okay.
And it just happened today in Mr. Steele's class, and it's a perfect example of the children learning to think critically about history. I walked in with a couple of parents, and Mr. Steele was talking about the colonies and the eastern coast of the U.S., and he asked the students, so they're all grouped in these states on the coast. Why haven't they moved inward? And the answer he was looking for was, well, the Appalachian Mountains are in the way. They haven't figured out how to get past that. But little Autumn, whom I love, raised her hand and said, well, and this is because she understood what was going on in their lives at this time, well, they want to be close to the coast because they can then be close to their ships and they can trade, and that's how they'll have their commerce. And the parents that I was giving her to were like, what? Because she's a second grader. She's itty bitty, and she's thinking critically. And Mr. Steele said, that's true. That's not the answer I'm looking for. But that was a very good answer. She was thinking about, what was going on in their lives as colonists. And, why it is that they.
She had knowledge that she was bringing to bear on it, and she was.
I didn't ask them, what route do you think they took?
Well, tomorrow. There's always tomorrow. Okay, thank you everybody for coming.